Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I'm very happy to be joined by John Simon. A lot of people listening will know who John is, but I'll just give a short introduction. John has 30 years of work experience at both the RBA and IMF. He's most well known for his role as RBA Research Department head for about a decade, where he was focused on building out not just sort of structural modeling insights and how they can be used to help inform central bank decisions, but a lot of microdata work, which is something close to my heart. Importantly, from my perspective, he also brought my wife over from New Zealand, which is the only reason I'm in Australia in the first place. So he's part of the reason the podcast has even been set up. How's it going, John?
Well, since I've left the bank, I've really enjoyed the ability to, let's say, range more freely in my thinking than just monetary policy or the research department. And that's actually been fun. I think when you're in a job and you're focused narrowly on something, it can be, well, like any job. But I think being able to do economics for fun has really given me back the joy, if you will, that I had when I first started out.
No, that's very true. And I've noticed you're writing a lot about institutions and a lot about current affairs on LinkedIn, and I'd recommend everyone goes over to LinkedIn and follows John. I'll just put a link in the post down below this. So I think today it would be good to just chat a bit about institutions and the sort of things you've been thinking about more recently. And with that, I mean, it's just good to hand over and ask, what do you think about when you think about institutions, and sort of where would you like to take this conversation today?
Sure. I suppose there are two broad levels of institutions, and the most obvious institution, given my background to talk about, would be a central bank. But central banks, treasuries, consumer regulators, all those sorts of government institutions are really built on a foundation of much lower level institutions that I think we all take for granted. And these are things like the rule of law or international trade agreements, the property rights and things like that I think we haven't thought about a lot. But with the recent turmoil with a trade war on, and looking at, are any agreements that are signed with America enforceable anymore? That concept of the rule of law and what is it that we take for granted, like the air we breathe, those are deep institutions, and they're deep institutions that actually have a lot to do with the kind of world we live in, and are things that economics typically takes for granted. So when you talk about, I'm going to buy something at a particular price, what you're assuming is, well, that contract is somehow enforceable. We don't worry about the fact that the contract is, I'm going to buy something and you're going to deliver it. We assume that happens. But if it no longer happens, then you're in a whole different world. But kind of thinking about the institutions, first just thinking about how does a central bank operate as more than just an equation in a new Keynesian model in terms of the people in it and how that affects what it does. And also, what are the foundations that's built upon that we typically take for granted, but in recent days we've discovered you can't take it all for granted. So
that's very true. I remember when I was a young economist, my brother, who's also an economist, he told me that the two main areas where economists can struggle to answer questions that become important when there's big shocks are questions of power and questions of institutions. A lot of my old sociologist friends would probably admit, if you asked them, that whenever they would bring up institutional questions, I would become quite arrogant and rule them out. The view of it was that institutions were just the rules of the game, and once we agreed with those rules, they'd be in place. How would you say that current events are pointing to weakness in institutions, and where there are economists and economic frameworks that can help us think about them?
Yeah, I think when you look around and you start looking at the institutions, you realize there are actually a whole lot of design principles or rules that are built into them. So, at a high level, you can talk about, well, we've got a democracy versus autocracies or monarchies, but those all have kind of assumptions about where power exists in a society or a country. And we don't kind of typically ask, why is it that way? We just take it for granted because we've lived this way. But there's been a lot of thinking along the way about, well, are there some institutions that work better than others? And so the work of my PhD supervisor, Doron Asamoglu, which earned him a Nobel Prize recently, was very much looking at what is the causality between institutions and growth, and which institutions work better. And the gist of it was inclusive institutions, ones that essentially give everyone a voice, both economically and politically, are ones that are generally associated with better growth. And so it's really saying that there's a whole lot more to, let's say, democracy or inclusivity than just morality, if you will, or ideals that we have. There's actually a very pragmatic basis for these sorts of things, which is they actually help you focus on growth and individuals, well, pursuing the profit motive. You know, this is the Adam Smith one, is even underlying Adam Smith's ideas of kind of individuals just seeking with the invisible hand to seek their own profit. They can't do that if they can't rely on, you know, well, national defense, security, the rule of law. They don't have to employ private armies in order to defend their interests. They can just focus on setting up a company and trading. Perhaps in the old days we called it political economy, but economists have kind of moved on from that, because, yeah, you can take a lot of it for granted, but suddenly when it goes away, you have to go back and, yes, I've been briefly reading over Leviathan from Hobbes, which is kind of one of those first arguments for why do we have governments at all, and it's really to protect ourselves from each other in some ways, that there's this mutually beneficial arrangement whereby we all agree to certain rules of the game that are actually good for us in the long run and kind of squash down on that rather more competitive human instinct.
No, that makes sense. The other concept that comes often into that is, I believe it's Rousseau's social contract. So the idea that there's ultimately some form of agreement about how the rules of the game are set up when people go into some sort of agreement. And when there's social or structural change, that it can be time to renegotiate that contract, and that's where things can get messy. Do you think those sorts of concepts are giving us insights to what's happening now, or do you think that there's just been some sort of misunderstanding or misinformation about the social contract that exists?
I think that, well, one of my recent posts was talking about, you know, where can we understand this coming from? And it was essentially saying that the US, despite being rich, is actually a very unequal society. And so what you've got now is you've got a segment of society that is feeling economically disenfranchised, and this is a constant battle that's going on, and that's playing out in very destructive ways. But this is the thing that, you know, the social contract is really about trying to redirect those energies or make sure that you don't actually have those people left behind, because what then happens is you get this social conflict. And I think there is actually a very simple economics idea that underlies a lot of this. And I don't know how many people have heard of the prisoner's dilemma, but that essentially is what's going on in the social contract, which is the idea that if we both cooperate with each other, the outcomes for both of us are better than if we both compete with each other, let's say. But the way the game is set up is that if I'm trusting, you can rip me off and you can make a personal profit. But of course, in that environment, what happens is that if there's no trust anymore, instead of us both cooperating, which is mutually beneficial, we end up both competing with each other, and that leads us to be both worse off. And so then the whole idea of governments and the social contract then becomes, well, if this is essentially the fundamental nature of interactions in a society or an economy, how can we encourage people to go with the win-win solution, the cooperate game theory play, rather than compete, or in the words of the prisoner's dilemma, think, as I learnt it.
No, that makes sense, and I think that comes back to the idea that there's an increasing view of games being, not having win-win situations, so being zero sum, in other words. When we have a low productivity growth and sort of weaker growth in technological outcomes in terms of how they'll produce output, people can sort of feel that way, and that can sort of drive these conflicts. And perhaps the institutions we had before aren't as sustainable. Do you think that's a fair description of what's happening?
Yeah, well, I guess yes. There are certain assumptions that they're built on, and perhaps society goes through phases where they forget certain things that they took for granted and then they remember them. So in the US, there was the kind of the robber barons and the Gilded Age, which was very unequal and power accrued to the wealthy. But then that was replaced eventually with the New Deal, which was really about spreading the wealth around much more evenly. And in recent years, they've been kind of cycling back to more the kind of oligarchs and the tech bros having all the power in the economy. And so societies go through those cycles, and I think they get to kind of an extreme and then they either snap back or something breaks. And I think this was the work of Duran Acemoglu and Robinson, etc., which was they were actually observing that if you didn't get those institutions right, it was very hard for you actually to break out of a pretty low wealth economy, the extractive institutions. The US perhaps is one of those that managed to break out of the kind of the low wealth kind of extractive institutions that have led to, lots of poverty in lots of places in the world. But it's kind of cycling away from that. And so it's losing that foundation. But yeah, they said we're a country of laws. And I think what you're suddenly discovering is there are also norms in there. And so perhaps this is an observation about institutions. It's surprising how hard it is to craft a perfect institution that is able to resist all forces on it, and how much trust, goodwill, just norms of behavior actually constrain the way we work. And that's perhaps something I observed in the micro at the RBA. There's, a theoretical idea of how we all relate to each other. And then there's the fact that we're a whole bunch of humans. And as humans, we have our own flaws and our particular idiosyncrasies that actually mean it's much harder for us to debate a topic without feeling personally offended sometimes.
Related to what you've said, the US is an example of someone that's escaped that trap, but I think one of the most incredible examples is Australia, given its strong focus on mining resources and sort of a resource type economy, given the fact that, the complexity of production in Australia is much lower than a lot of similar countries, but because of strong institutions, because of trust, you end up with this big surplus of value add that comes from the way people structure. And Australia is incredibly wealthy, not just for a country that focuses on primary resources, but as a country. And New Zealand, to a much lesser extent, being 30% poorer, is in a similar boat. Do you think there's special lessons from Australia about how institutions can work and institutions can be structured that would be useful for the rest of the world?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the aspects we have that is commonly mentioned when you compare with the US is the fact that we've got compulsory voting. But what that does is that essentially draws the politics towards the middle, towards the median voter, rather than, as seems to happen in the US, towards the extremes, which is fundamentally a more inclusive approach to the way you conduct your politics. And I think that example is a really good one. But once again, you've got various other aspects like, no gerrymanders, or at least we've got an independent institution that sets up those electoral boundaries, which means that you have more representativeness. But yeah, I was thinking about this, and there are kind of two extremes, if you will, of how do you set up, well, political arrangements. We've got both. One is, multi-party electorates or multi-member electorates, like the Senate, or in some places they've got that, but it's where you're actually representing a very large body of people. And what that leads towards is thinking about what is good for kind of the people, a very broad grouping of people. And then you've got single member electorates like we have in the House of Representatives, which is where you've got this much greater connection with the local area. But that leads ultimately, let's say, to pork barreling and very narrow interests. And, they both have advantages, but what you notice about many countries is they have both. Some way of kind of balancing out those two extremes, that you really do want people, setting policies that are good for everyone, rather than this kind of more competitive local interest, which does get closer to that zero-sum quality, which is, well, where are we going to put the local football stadium and the $100 million we're going to spend on it? And you have, local members arguing over it. And when you think that, well, we're going to put it somewhere and everybody can get on the train and go to see it. So, why does it matter so much? Why do we waste so much effort trying to do that, rather than thinking about it at a slightly more general level, which is, instead of electorates competing or states competing over various things, why can't we have some slightly better arrangement? And that's what you get with kind of these, Senate and House of Reps in Australia, but you have it in other areas. But I think the aspect of that is also important is, we don't have a monarchy, an autocracy, a dictatorship, or things like that. And, at least for a long time in the US, they said we've got this separation of powers, and the head of state in the president is balanced by the others too. But what we're seeing in the US is this reversion to this kind of autocracy, which has a lot of attractions to it. I mean, I think if you go back and you read Plato's Republic, he was all in favor of the philosopher kings. And indeed, even in Leviathan, Hobbes was in favor of essentially a single ruler, because they get stuff done. But I think the problems you see is that they're also people. And once again, this is the thing that I've started off as an idealistic economist, thinking that we could assume all that stuff away. But yeah, when you put the power in one person's hand, the fact that there is, so many human failings mean that ultimately you end up with very bad outcomes when you have that situation.
Related to what you're discussing, the first thing it brings to mind is New Zealand moved from a first past the post system to a mixed member proportional political system. So switching from the very pork barrel based individual member system for every MP to a system that was purely proportional, and you could see the nature of politics change. And it did remove pork barreling, but also led to a lot more pressure for bureaucratic agencies to start selling things in terms of the social will and in terms of some sort of subject matter that was harder for the public to assess. And I think that in part has started to undermine the bureaucracy in New Zealand and its ability to provide transparent information to the public in a way that New Zealand was very proud of in the 80s and the 1990s. Now, that makes me think that when we often talk about these questions and we're thinking about policy, we don't just have the politicians and the public, but we also have the bureaucracy, and we have them functioning in terms of their own set of incentives with their own objectives in ways that can be conducive to improve public policy debate and worsen public policy debate. I was wondering that when we think about the incentives for the bureaucracy and when we think about the way it's seen, do you see any flashpoints happening at the moment? Because to my mind, the bureaucracy is in the middle of a lot of these games, but they can't speak for themselves a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, I think this is perhaps a nice segue to my experience at a central bank, because there is, a lot of a lot of countries have given central banks independence, and what they have decided is it's better to allocate certain tasks to independent agencies because in the case of central banks, there is this political incentive to essentially spend money now, not worry about the inflationary consequences, or lower interest rates before an election. And once again, that's worse in the long run. And so the role of the bureaucracy, or let's say at least independent institutions, is very important, I think, in, once again, balancing the political incentives that you get from your elected representatives against good policy for a longer run. And what you see, at least in the RBA, was it was delegated authority, but once you do that, you need to still have some way of controlling their incentives. And you were commenting in New Zealand that the incentives of the bureaucracy have changed. In the case of the RBA, we had one set of incentives up until the review hit, and now there's this process of transition going on as kind of the rules of the game surrounding what the RBA does have been at least clarified and narrowed in order to ensure that that delegated authority is exercised in a way that is good for the people. Because one of the things that former Deputy Governor at the RBA, Guy Debelle, wrote about with how independent should a central bank be, and made the argument that what you want to do is you want to give it instrument independence. That is, you give it goal independence, which is what they should be aiming for, 2.5% inflation, let's say, but then you give it freedom over how it achieves that. In the case of the RBA, it claimed for a while that it had a triple mandate, which was full employment, stability of the currency, and the welfare of the people of Australia, which is basically carte blanche to mean anything you want it at all to mean. And without any kind of clarity there, with limited transparency, there's no way of telling, are they actually doing the job we've actually delegated to them? And so when you set up your bureaucracies, you want to have kind of, what is the dimensions in which they've got freedom and which don't they have? And I think you want to set that up clearly. In the kind of the Westminster tradition, it used to be that you had these independent, enduring public service agencies, and you had secretaries or whatever who were essentially immune to political forces, and they could give frank and fearless advice. I think what you've seen in Australia and many countries, and in the US, they go to an extreme. They've never pretended that you had this independent bureaucracy. They had kind of a spoiled system where you replace all the heads of all the government departments, whereas in Australia, we for a long time had, there was an independence there, and what they did is they advised the government of the day about how they wanted to achieve their ends. But we've had this kind of weakening of that particular institutional structure with a pressure for them to become responsive. And responsive means essentially, don't advise me, don't tell me I can't do this, or don't tell me this is a stupid idea, just make it happen. And I think, the most recent bad example of that is perhaps robo-debt, where I think there were probably a lot of people in there saying this is a bad idea, and indeed is not going to work the way you think it's going to do. But then you had a lot of people who were just being responsive to the minister and doing whatever they wanted. And I think that's, once again, you want to set up your institutions, and at least in the old system, the public sector was essentially a break on really bad policy from politicians. And that was also part of the interaction that you have when you set these things up. With a central bank, once again, you want them independent, but you want to make sure that they're not doing whatever they want. You want to be very clear about what it is they're doing. So I think New Zealand started off very hardcore and very precise, and they said, it's the governor's responsible, and if they don't get it done, we're going to fire them. Now, it turned out in practice that didn't quite work because it felt like a nuclear option, and so there was always an excuse for why inflation wasn't at target. And they've evolved towards kind of saying we should have a committee making these decisions, because we see committees as making better decisions all up. And that is also the way that the RBA review has pushed, which is actually what we want, is we want kind of a balance of experts, but we recognize this is a very difficult task. It's not something that you essentially can vote on. That's why we've got an independent central bank in the first place. If you asked everybody to vote on what do you want interest rates to be? You get exactly the same answer as we always got from the politicians. Oh, let's always have lower interest rates. But we know how that story ends. And so it's once again trying to find that balance of how do you set up an institution to reflect what is good for the people, but work in an effective way. And so, yes, you have boards rather than individuals, because when you've got an individual, as we've seen in, autocracies or whatever, that can undermine the culture of whatever it is that they're leading.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it shows that institutional structure is really the key element of our time, and a lot of it like bureaucratic institutional structure. So when I look at a lot of the discussion that's happening, both in Australia and overseas, there's a lot of saying we're concerned about the deep state. There are too many public servants. We need to, clamp down on this. But then at the same time, the information necessary to inform the public and to implement and administer a lot of policies that they want isn't there. And when I listen to a lot of my friends that talk that way, often what they're saying is exactly what you're saying. We want things done. There appears to be these holdups, and it's to do with small scale practical things. Take, for example, housing. So, you have people like Peter Tulip on Twitter pointing out how much housing gets held up in bureaucratic processes. And it's this whole concern about NIMBYs and this process that's supposed to be inclusive and making sure that people's views are heard is being abused to stop housing occurring. And people want to see those things overridden. The problem is that's morphing into destroy the public service when actually the main part of the public service is experiencing the opposite. They don't have the freedom to give good advice. They don't have the space to provide information to the public. And when these things get morphed together, you end up going in a dark direction one way or the other. Even if we had a public service that was given the resources to do information, suddenly we start moving towards this idea of a bureaucratic colossus, where a lot of public servants will say, my remit as a health department isn't just working on health. It is about making sure that dairies are positioned in certain places, that vape stores are positioned in certain areas. It's submitting on where a building will be built. And we see that happening in Australia and New Zealand as well as overseas. So how do we balance these concerns about how bureaucracies are set up when we're thinking about how governmental institutions and structures are established?
Well, yeah, I don't think anybody's come up with the perfect answer yet, but I think we at least need to be very conscious of the issues that are at play. So I think I started off talking about, Senate versus reps, single member versus larger bodies. And, with housing, one of the things you've got is you've essentially got local councils and local residents making decisions about housing. Once you bring the state government into it, as we see in New South Wales here, they have a broader picture. They say, actually, we see that there are a lot of people who can't afford to buy a house, and you need to have that broader perspective if you want to make a decision that is good for the people of New South Wales in that case, and more broadly Australia, because that kind of narrow focus of local councils is just too narrow, because they're not considering the interests of anybody who doesn't happen to live there already. And so I think that is certainly one aspect that you need to think about, who are the voices that need to be at the table? And I think for a long time, it was only the NIMBYs at the table in the local council areas. I think as the problems have gotten worse and worse, it's become clear that we need more people at the table. So I think, you need to look at who's at the table, who's involved in it. And then I think that you point to the other one, which is, well, if it's just the bureaucrats, what they're doing is they're responding to their own incentives. And to a certain extent, there's always been this concern about bureaucracies getting captured by the people they regulate. And I think that is also a very hard one. And the best way that I'm aware of that people come up with is at least transparency. Because I think when they start making deals for their own convenience, I couldn't be bothered doing that, and then you've got, it's not explicit corruption you're talking about here. It's just, it's nice to get along, and the people you talk to are the people you regulate a lot, and so suddenly you just start making compromises. And I think that's where, how do you keep the bureaucracy from becoming captured essentially, or pursuing their own interests, is you need to have a degree of transparency about the decisions. You need to make them reviewable. Now, in a lot of countries, we do have it. There's a judiciary, and so people who are aggrieved by a particular decision can challenge those. And so I think that is also why we haven't mentioned it yet, but it is an important aspect of how do well-functioning societies set up work. It's that you do have some ability to challenge decisions, and the foundation for that has to be, how was the decision made? You need to have that transparency. So the bureaucracies essentially need to be open with their work. And indeed, this is something at the Reserve Bank. Why do you want transparency? I think a lot of people think about the Reserve Bank and communication as just being one more tool for them to use to affect inflation. We want to say certain words that will affect people's inflation expectations, but it's much deeper than that. It's actually so we've got to show our working, or the central bank needs to show it's working, but any bureaucracy needs to show it's working precisely because you might make mistakes. I think there's this human one. I don't want to show my working because you might actually point out something wrong with it. It takes a very self-assured, or a certain kind of person who is actually willing to show their working because it's a feature, not a bug, that you might find out that there's something wrong with it. So I think that's the best answer I've got, which is you need to insist upon transparency, and you need to then have some way of reviewing those decisions, which we do have at least in theory in a lot of cases, but the ways that you can frustrate that if you don't truly believe in the underlying principle, I think, are many and varied. And so that's why you've got to keep on with that. And it's not about, communication is not about spin. I mean, I think it commonly devolves into that. But it's about fundamentally transparency, about why did you make the decision, what was the logic there, and then you're exposing it to everyone else so that they can actually challenge it if there's a flaw in it. And I think that is, you've got to have the decision at the right level, the right people at the table, but then you also need to make sure that your logic is clear and transparent and sufficiently detailed that somebody can actually challenge it.
Oh, exactly. And I think that sort of transparency is definitely important from the bureaucracy's level. There is the discussion of judicial elements that you brought up, and I think this touches on an area where you'll have quite a lot of expertise, but I just want to give a short example so that listeners sort of know where we are. With the growth of microdata and a lot of administrative data being provided to people who are doing research in order to understand economic concepts and sort of how policies have an influence, there's this growing concern around the risk of identification and the risk of individuals' information being used against their will, or them not having the right over it. And when I was working on a project in New Zealand, and I want to be careful with my words because this is an example of where I believe it went quite well. The law was changed so that we could collect information from high wealth individuals, amongst other things. That wasn't the only reason the law was changed, but that was an outcome of it. And there was a lot of lawyer involvement in terms of determining the disposal of information, the way it was treated, lawyer involvement from potential client side to help us understand the sensitivities and make sure that we were meeting people's rights. And that entire legal process led to a situation where the people involved felt like their legal rights were heard, and the information was provided by almost everyone without any sort of legal hassle or legal recourse. So that judicial process functioned really well. When we look at the US, it looks like there's increasing fraying of their judicial process and its independence. How do you see the judicial process being threatened by the fact that now we collect so much information about people, and a lot of legal principles of privacy and the such are making these cases harder to judge and potentially threatening judicial independence? Do you think it's making this a more difficult issue across the globe?
Yeah, so I must say I was generally relaxed about this kind of sharing of information because I saw, let's say, people with good motives trying essentially to make people's lives better. But the examples we're hearing from the US now about Doge going in to the IRS, to the Social Security Administration, and trying to link up all these databases which had not been linked for privacy reasons. And so in particular, the Social Security Administration and the IRS, they're trying to get data on illegal immigrants, or whatever you want to call them. And in the past, they'd said, we will not share your information with anyone. And so you can essentially, to the benefit of America, you can pay your taxes. Now they're going to try and use it in order to deport them. And so suddenly you're undermining that. So I think there is a very real fear of how a government might misuse all this information. At the same time, there is a great benefit, which is, for example, you can find out who needs help. And I think a lot of the problem with government programs is it's very hard to target them at the people who really need the help. And they come up with certain rules about who's going to get it. But what you typically find is it ends up benefiting the people who can work the system more. So, you're trying to target, let's say, disadvantaged people generally. But what you find is the really disadvantaged people don't have the time to work out all the rules of the government programs and don't know how to fill in the forms or whatever it is, or to apply for the benefits. And what you get is actually people who are basically just on the line between advantaged and disadvantaged benefit the most. And indeed, then you can get people changing their behavior. And what you find is that you're not benefiting the people you thought you were going to benefit. You're ending up benefiting people who can play the game better. And the advantage of having all this microdata is that you can get a much more fine-grained way of understanding, who is it that we're really trying to help, as opposed to do we use some, quick and dirty rules that are subject to gaming. And so I think, there are great benefits there, which is you can essentially get the money where it's needed most, where it can do the most benefit. But of course, if you don't trust the government to do that, or if the government's going to use it to punish people like that, then all bets are off and it all devolves into a situation where you don't have access to any of this information. And I guess this is, what is the most fundamental thing that keeps a society together? I think it's trust. You trust the government to do the right thing. You take that trust away and all sorts of norms and institutions just break down. And so privacy laws are trying to kind of limit the information that is available, but ultimately it's about what are you going to do with the information? That's the thing. And I was certainly a bit more blasé because, heck, people have given this information to Facebook and things like that. And what's Facebook using it for? Well, it's using it for very malign purposes, or at least people are using it, for political targeting, for, putting people into their echo chamber and just amplifying extremist views. So, that's an aspect where I thought, well, the government at least is elected. And so you can, as a society, have greater control over what the government does with your information. And then you need to set up rules which essentially say, we're going to give you this information, but if you use it for nefarious purposes or purposes which we as a electorate don't agree with, we're going to punish you, in the case of politicians, by not electing you again, but there also need to be other balances there. So it's more a case of, instead of trying to prevent that information from being used, I think it's better if you have the strong punishments for misuse. And indeed, that's the way a lot of, I think, confidential information is managed in various government agencies, which is you've actually got access to a whole lot of this stuff. And if you want, and they'll do some checks on who you are, and if you wanted to do something nefarious with it, you probably could, but we're going to punish you, we're going to put you in jail if you do that. That, I think, is a balance that has been worked out. So rather than preventing the sharing and the linking up of the information in the first place, you just say we've got very strong penalties on anybody who misuses it. That way you can get the benefits, you can target kind of benefits to people who need it more, and you can do good. And then the way you control the incentive to do harm is through these kind of ex post controls, but nonetheless, they're going to affect people's incentives.
Yeah. On the example of Social Security and the costs of people associated with taking it up, it's this type of microdata that showed us that it wasn't people on the margin who were avoiding taking up benefits because of these costs. It was people who were extremely vulnerable. So we've been able to do that type of research across the globe to find that out. And it actually pushed against a 1990s policy view, which was that it would only be people who only had a small benefit. They were on the margin of the benefit anyway, though they wouldn't receive much. They're the ones that would drop out. A lot of policy was based on that, and it's led to much better social policy as a result. And when we think about Australia and New Zealand making use of this data, we can look at survey data and we can see that response rates are a lot higher than in other countries, pointing to a situation where likely the public does trust the way data is treated and the way we're going to use their personal information more than in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, which is encouraging. But would you say there are key lessons about institutional weakness and institutional problems that might be showing up in Australia that we need to be aware of?
It does seem that we have, I don't know, become complacent, or there's just this slow erosion of norms and expectations. And so, yeah, we can always compare ourselves to somewhere else and say, well, we're better than the US or we're better than the UK. But I think the thing that has frustrated me is that kind of, well, at least, that comparison, rather than aiming for something better and saying, no, but we can be better. We know that we're falling short, and trying to work out how do you instill that in people. And, I don't know if civics lessons or things like that help. I don't know if the kind of, what is it? Some kind of ethics training, what is it that essentially gives people that feeling of shared ownership of something, but also of, Australia is the country of a fair go. I mean, that is something that is honoured in the breach more often than not. But nonetheless, I think, that national identity is something that I think you really want to protect. And that is certainly fraying as we're getting more extremism, more kind of views, more often than not, being imported from the rest of the world into Australia. And trying to think about, how do you actually bring people together as a society to, they don't have to agree with each other, but to have some, understanding of shared values or shared humanity to, work together. Now, I'm not too sure what it is, but I think it's even more fundamental than the institutions. It's, this sense of shared purpose or ownership over the country that underlies so much of that, because once that phrase, then all bets are off, it seems, because you suddenly stop trusting the judiciary or the politicians or things like that. And so I think that is a very important aspect of society working well. And, well, perhaps I'll circle back to the work of, Why Countries Fail and Acemoglu and Robinson, etc., which was that what you want is that economic inclusivity, which is essentially, if you leave people behind, that is something that feeds that sense of grievance. And so in the US, you've got a lot of former manufacturing workers that were left behind in Rust Belt cities, and they did nothing about it. Other countries have done it much better. They offered retraining, they offered, unemployment benefits, or they offered income support for people who had been harmed by or who lost their jobs as a result of the evolution of economies away from manufacturing towards services. And I think that is one aspect of why it's not touchy-feely, or, I don't need to be some kind of left-wing radical to say that I care about equality. It's that, no, actually, when we all have that sense of shared achievement, and you can actually see it in the fact that, yes, people are taken care of, that actually contributes towards this overall feeling that society is fair and that I can achieve what I want. And if I fall through the cracks or something bad happens, I will be helped. And, I think healthcare is also a big one of those in the US, where you've got, medical bankruptcies and things like that. Once again, you get a lot of people feeling disenfranchised economically because now they can't work because they couldn't afford to get the surgery or whatever it was. So I think, that aspect of, you need to have your institutions that have, I'm not talking complete equality of outcomes in some kind of communist ideal, but I am saying that you actually need to have a set of institutions and a recognition that from the wealthiest, that taking care of the disadvantaged is actually in my personal benefit. Now, a more extreme version of that is what Acemoglu et al. Pointed out, which is, essentially you've got to stop them from having a revolution. There have been lots of revolutions, and they don't come from the aristocracy. They come from the people. But, so that is kind of a pragmatic way of doing it. If you're not swayed by just the kind of common humanity, if you will, then I think there's that pragmatic one as well. But, this is what makes a society function, is you do need to have a degree of equality in terms of the way you're treated, and making sure that, random shocks, you catch something, it doesn't mean in terms of a disease or something like that, you will be taken care of in a way that means that you have to exit the labour force. But, from a purely GDP related way, that's also good, because it means that somebody can remain a productive member of society and contribute to the overall well-being. So I think that is, what is an element that you need to have in there. I do think a degree of redistribution is an important part of keeping society together, because that contributes to ultimately trust and a sense of shared ownership of the outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think with that type of redistribution, it comes from people sort of tangibly feeling that, because you can see in the US, you've got a lot of poorer people actually pushing against redistribution because they feel like a redistributive system won't be redistributing them, or be redistributing to the middle. And Australia and New Zealand both have very targeted redistributive systems that try to support those that experience the worst shocks in terms of their unemployment benefit system and in terms of healthcare, and similar education style systems and similar education funding in terms of the loans you can take out and then being at concessionary interest rates. And two similar cultures. But I want to talk a little bit about the COVID period and get your thoughts from here. In Australia, I've been told by a large number of Treasury officials, like probably more fingers than I have number of officials, that when JobKeeper was put in place, it was because of concerns about the social fabric fraying and trust breaking down in society. So JobKeeper was put in as an urgent scheme because it felt like everything was going to fall apart at that stage. I was in New Zealand at the same time. There was already a wage subsidy and a lockdown, and there was a lot of this, there wasn't this talk of the social fabric. People were all sort of accepting that New Zealand had the sharpest lockdown in the world. And a stringency index, it was number one, even though there were very few outbreaks in the country. And people just sort of sat through that. And there was a feeling in New Zealand that we have the highest level of trust. But once you got 2 years down the track, you'd had Melbourne locked down for a long time, and you had the trucker protests here. But in New Zealand, things had become a lot more frayed. And when I've talked to my old colleagues and friends in New Zealand, it sounds like there's a lot of breakdown of social trust, a lot of anger still from that COVID period, when in Australia it feels like that is cleared out. Even though the two sets of responses look sort of similar, and with the Melbourne lockdowns going on for so long, it feels like in some ways parts of Australia had it worse. Do you have any insights into why it feels like the COVID shock didn't affect trust in Australia as much in other places, such as a similar place as New Zealand? Or am I just completely wrong as well, and it did, and I'm just blind?
So I didn't experience it, but I think, so Australia was very compliant. I guess you could say that there was a high degree of trust, but there were certainly a lot of negative things that were going on, and they built up over time. And at least in Sydney, the sense that the western suburbs were treated differently to the wealthier areas of Sydney, and kind of the differential enforcement of rules, I think did lead to an undermining of trust. I'm not too sure exactly how that has bubbled to the surface or whether it's gone away. I think you'd have to talk to people who are affected by that to get some sense of it. But so I think there was some erosion. Have we got over it? I don't know. The one that I saw most was the state premiers saying, I'm for Queenslanders, I'm for Victorians, I'm for Western Australians, as opposed to we're all Australian. And that kind of parochialism I found really quite galling. And indeed, the way they were treating people who were, for example, by any definition, Queenslanders, but happened to be in New South Wales when they shut their borders, was quite appalling. Now, what have you seen is, well, you've seen those leaders have been turfed out. So, people put up with it for a while, they agreed with it for a while, but it went on for way too long. Put an aside there, yes. And JobKeeper also started out well, but perhaps went on for way too long. But I think there has been the pushback. But in Australia, perhaps what you've seen, I don't know if it happened in New Zealand, is that people have kicked out the people who implemented the bad policies. Hopefully, there's some learning there about, uh, you know, do we do this again? We've got to make sure we're much better targeted. We need to be much less kind of black and white. You're a health risk. We don't care that your father's dying, or some more nuanced approach to those things rather than these very hard and fast black and white rules, which were essentially, when you don't have any information early on in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going on. And so those very strong restrictions until you find out what's going on made sense. But I think the difficulty was we couldn't pivot from that. And I think that is something that then meant that a lot of these policies persisted way too long. There was this is a human bias, this status quo bias, or I don't want to change it because, I made all the cases that these restrictions were worthwhile. It would be, cognitively dissonant for me to try and now say, well, actually now we're going to change to something else because, ultimately because the world has changed. And I think this is one aspect where I don't know what the long-term effects in Australia are. I did some minor research when I looked at the differences between people in, let's say, Melbourne and Western Australia in terms of how long they were locked down. And you did actually see some persistent effects. And so this is a much larger literature that shows that experiences you have as a teenager or natural disasters or things like COVID can actually have really long-lasting effects on the way you approach risk or your tolerance for certain behaviours. And so there is, underneath it all, I'm sure that people who are in Melbourne are going to be behaving slightly more differently to people who happen to be in Perth during that period. But has it bubbled out into something dramatic? Possibly not.
To give an anecdote, a lot of my cohort graduated coming into the global financial crisis, and almost all of those economists now hate economics, even though I think economics provided a hell of a great framework for understanding the GFC and everything happening around it. So it does really affect what people come into, and important parts of their lives affect how they go through and how they view life going forward. And we know with COVID that a lot of people who are going through education during COVID have ended up with lower test scores and not picking up some of the skills they would have normally because of all the disruption they were facing. Now, what amazed me during COVID was the amount the state, including in the US, but in Australia and New Zealand, actually came in and dictated actions. It felt like within 2 weeks, we'd gone from a situation where we were making fun of China to some degree for locking everything down to suddenly locking everything down ourselves. And that was a whiplash that I think in a lot of people's heads crossed a line about what we view as the limits of liberal democracy and what it can achieve. Given uncertainty, these were lines that we were saying needed to be crossed, but that could have fundamentally changed people's tolerance for, the size of the state, the strength of the state, and the structure of the state. Do you feel like there is a view that the state and that the government is too large in some ways and has too much ability to affect individuals' lives and individuals' choices? And that's a lot of the rebellion we're seeing by people and people voting for Trump. It's distaste with that rather than any sort of inherent wanting a stronger dictator to take them through.
Certainly the US has a very different founding mythology than Australia. It's very individual. They've always been much smaller government, keep the government hands off my Medicare. So I think that is that is their fundamental founding mythology. Australia's one is, fair go, mateship, whatever, which is quite different. And I think that really does affect a lot of, size of government or, how much government is involved in things. But, thinking about this as an economist, when I started out, this idealism of, it all works, I take certain things for granted and the price mechanism works. I think as I've gone on, you realize it works some of the time, maybe most of the time, but there are a lot of, market failures, if you will, or there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And so you do need to have somebody setting the rules of the game. And indeed, these are some of the rules of the game that we take for granted, even in a small government kind of world, which is, property rights and legal enforceability. That is a really big contribution of government to the ability to earn money, even in the US. They perhaps don't recognize that. And indeed, Obama had a quote that the Republicans went off at, when he said, look at those roads, but those bridges, you didn't build that. And then you had a whole bunch of people saying, yes, I did. I built my business. And it's like, yeah, but you did it on the back of lots of public infrastructure. So he was pointing to the physical infrastructure, but there's also the legal infrastructure that I think people were taking for granted. And which is, if somebody stiffs you on a contract, you need to be able to actually go and enforce that contract and get your money or get your goods. And that is just fundamental to doing business in any country around the world. And indeed, there have been studies that look, in the deep past, which is, property rights and the ability to get a legal ruling in a reasonable amount of time, which is one of the things that, for example, common law countries do really well. They can give you legal certainty much quicker than in civil law kind of countries. And so that actually leads to greater prosperity because, yes, you can make decisions and you have a trust that you're going to do okay with it. And if something goes wrong, you can actually have redress. So I think those sorts of things, what is the size of the government? I think, the government, as a percent of GDP in terms of its spending is one thing, but government involvement in essentially the air you breathe, the water you drink, but also the legal environment that you operate in is fundamental to society. Otherwise, you're just in the world of private armies and the destructiveness and the excess costs involved in always protecting your own, as you might have been back in tribal societies, let's say, where it's all very small clans fighting each other all the time. I think there is great benefits to agglomeration, and that requires this kind of framework that you all operate in. So, and then you need to choose, exactly what are the rules such that you get the incentives right, that you don't distort things too much. And economists have spent a lot of time thinking about that. And, I think those are much more fundamental than, how much spending the government does on education or health, although I think health and education, to the extent that they are public goods, are things that, generally speaking, you want to have the government involved in. You don't want it to be a case where, if you're born into a poor town, as happens in the US, you get a very poor education. You really want people to be able to be educated regardless of the status of their parents. And so once again, that's one reason why you want a government involved in that. And, most advanced economies have got to that, relatively large size of government. But even in places that reject that role for government, they would be surprised, I think, at how much the government, to the extent that it made the laws and has the judiciary, that underlies their ability to go about their lives.
Well, I like the Obama quote for not just the reason that of talking towards public infrastructure, but also because the stock of knowledge and stock of ideas and the land we have, they're all have some shared value across people. I mean, our knowledge about how the world works doesn't come just privately from one of us. It's something that comes from prior generations. And in some ways, the government is acting as an overseer and helping to make sure that we all share in the benefit of the fact that exists. And I think that's really important. The tricky thing I think comes in is when we go from that high level saying there's a surplus generated and we're going to redistribute it, to thinking about specific regulations and the potential for regulatory overreach. When we're really thinking about state and what the state does, it'll set a lot of rules and laws about certain things, and that's what people notice in their lives and what people sort of respond to. And Australia is a very, very regulation-heavy country. Coming from New Zealand, I am still absolutely amazed at how many different rules there are and about different things and different regulations And then some of the rules that are missing around like the quality of certain things and the customer's ability to complain in Australia is much less than in New Zealand. But then there are all these arbitrary rules around it. When Gulnara and I first came here, we kept getting kicked off our power company because another power company kept trying to take over because there was some law they were saying told them they had to service that house. And we went 6 months without paying a power bill because they kept swapping between each other. It was just incredibly weird, and neither of them would talk to us. When we messaged, they said, no, we have to talk to each other and sort this out. It was a very strange occurrence. Now, what I would normally take from that is, wow, this sort of regulation is frustrating. It's so annoying when people do that. But Australian culture, Australians are very comfortable with this and very comfortable with the rules and seem very trustworthy and trust each other. You can leave a bike out on the street and it won't get stolen. So I find Australia a really unique case in terms of having a lot of regulation and having a lot of trust. Is there anything you think that Australia has really done specifically that has caused this? And one thing I'm going to add here is the Murdoch media comes from Australia. Everyone blames the Murdoch media for tearing apart the US, but the Australian media is owned by Murdoch, and barely anyone I talk to actually takes any of that seriously. It's just like entertainment. So why is Australia so effective in this way?
Well, I don't know that I can point to that, but I do think one aspect that Australia does reasonably well with its regulations is it's more principles based. And I certainly have a trust that you can get a kind of good outcome, that you'll get somebody who's going to display some common sense and it should all work out. And that I've certainly experienced with kind of the ATO or other places, which is, oh, I made a mistake. And they'll say, that's fine, don't do it again. Let's just fix this up. Whereas I think in the US, it's like, we're going to fine you $100,000 because you didn't tick this box on your form, and sucks to be you, doesn't it? And, that's a very black letter approach to things. It's kind of, that comes from a very different place there. But I think Australia has generally got, maybe it's this sense of fair go, but I think it is this principles-based approach to regulation, which is there is this overriding idea, and it can work in both directions. One is, basically, if you were trying to do the right thing, we're not going to punish you harshly for that. Then the other side is, kind of general, kind of vague anti-avoidance in tax law, which is basically, doesn't matter if you've complied with the letter of the law. If we think that you're basically up to something funny, we can still come after you. Now, that ultimately requires trust. It does require a social contract that we're going to make all these rules and regulations. And I think perhaps we have gone way too far in some cases. And I think in your case, what's going on is the bureaucrats came up with these rules for very good reasons, but perhaps they didn't have the carve out. And so then you get this debate between two profit-seeking companies, and they're playing a game that is not ultimately in your benefit. But I think if you have that overarching thing of, what is the thing that, what's the saving grace of it? There's a principle there that we will use to decide the outcome here that is based on this nebulous, but I think reasonably solid idea of what is a fair outcome. I mean, this is in a sense what is the common law ultimately is about. There are these certain principles, and we look at, is this an equitable outcome, as opposed to kind of more black letter ones, which is we don't care if it's an equitable outcome. Did you follow the rules? And I think that is the aspect that saves Australia from what could be a really bad situation. If we had all these rules and you didn't follow these rules, there were punitive consequences from it. I think, well, you'd end up in a place that looks like America in many respects, which is, there are lots of rules in America perversely, because they don't like big government. They want to have very black and white rules about what's right and what's wrong. And if you don't prohibit it, it's fair game. This was their initial approach of trying to keep government small, which is, if we don't explicitly say something about it, you're okay. But of course, it never stops there. What happens is you start explicitly saying things about all sorts of things as you try and control people's conduct and try and essentially define what is a fair go. And so you end up with all sorts of rules, but you then don't have that principles-based foundation that keeps it all on track. So in Australia's case, yeah, we've got a lot of regulations. The thing that stops it from becoming perverse, I think, is this principles-based approach, which is something that comes from essentially common law. But yeah, compared to New Zealand, which is also exactly the same kind of tradition, how on earth we got here, I don't know. And I think we could do with fewer regulations. But perhaps I'll say what this really requires is you need a lot more economists thinking about incentives in the design of government regulations, and think about the case of what if you've got two companies that think they own your electricity bills, how do you resolve that? But eventually I think in Australia we do get to better places where we are willing to change the rules or whatever when they're not working to try and get those incentives working better. So I think, yeah, we've got principles based and we're not so hung up on very old rules, and we're willing to change them from time to time, although that's been going away. And I think that's why a lot of people are kind of disappointed with what's happening in Australia, which is, yeah, low productivity because we kind of got stuck in a rut and we're not doing anything to actually change things that aren't working. They're not blowing up, but they're really not helping us to become more prosperous.
In terms of the United States and what's been happening there, not just with Trump, but over the last 50 years, there has been sort of the situation of deregulation, defunding of the public services eventually led to a situation where you could have a Trump taking over government in the way he has. Do you think there's lessons from there for Australia in terms of its institutional and governance arrangements?
Well, certainly the one I've taken from it is that the kind of the grievances that the kind of the Rust Belt feels is where I feel the base for Trump is. And, that leaving behind a significant portion of your population is where that comes from. And so I think, what is the lesson that Australia needs to take from it is, if it becomes us versus them, or it's all about who wins and who loses, you end up with that kind of situation. And certainly the political parties are drifting in that direction with, profits are bad or unions are bad or whatever. That is ultimately something that can get worse when it's kind of, yeah, you're a capitalist or you're a worker. I think that is a path we don't want to go down. We want to see about making sure that, yeah, you do have decent unemployment benefits or whatever else it is for people who are disadvantaged. You want to make sure that people can have, a decent standard of living so that you don't get kind of opioid crisis and, Trump coming out, because that was a decision that the US made about, yeah, we're not going to be redistributed. We're going to be kind of dog eat dog, and that's our ethos, because we believe that we can make it, even though I think, yes, their social mobility is low, and that kind of idea they have of, yeah, I can make it, isn't there. I think the fact that we do have in Australia this greater sense of social belonging is a very important aspect of it. And I think that's one of the things that's fraying at the edges. And I think a lot of work, both pushing against that in our actions and our words, is an important part of not going down that path. And it requires ultimately, yeah, more shared compassion and understanding in terms of what we do and why do we have kind of, a redistributive tax system in the first place, and why do we try and make sure that we kind of balance things and target things well so that we're spending our money efficiently, but also trying to think about ways that it might be gained by people who are less in need of the help.
Yeah, and I think a big lesson related to all of that, from both the US and UK, is just the importance of inclusive labor markets. Australia and New Zealand, along with Scandinavian countries, have incredibly high labor force participation rates. When the US and UK, their participation, like the US participation rate is particularly bad, and the UK has these really specific gaps, especially around young men. And it's just worth monitoring and keeping an eye on these things. Are there job opportunities to help people get on that ladder? And that brings, that shows that there's a lot of wider institutions around labor markets, around the nature of firms and the way that we have concentration of firms. Are there any large private sector institutions that you have insights about or would be keen to cover?
I will say that, yes, they operate in an environment of, profit maximization or things like that. But what has surprised me is there's a whole lot of management theory about how do you run a private sector corporation well, and, how do you set it up? How do you ensure that, what is its internal structure? What's its board situation? Do you share CEO and chair? And, what are the expectations we have of directors of a company? Which ultimately are meant, in that one to, that they have to, respect the rights of shareholders broadly. But what has surprised me is how little of that management theory has affected the public sector. The public sector is still running in many cases on a 1950s model command and control approach to things, rather than kind of what has been discovered about how do you have organizations working well, and what are the institutional features. So I think, are there any that I can think of? No, but I do think essentially the public sector could learn a lot from, the Harvard Business School or the Harvard Business Review in terms of how do you actually run an organization well, because a lot of private sector organizations have got that. And what we've noticed recently is when those things go by the wayside, Qantas, for example, you had the CEO was not being held to account by the board, and this was ultimately to the detriment of the shareholders that the board were meant to be representing. The board became captured. But you see that as a governance issue, and I think that's the aspect where you want to think about, what are their institutional features. I actually think the public sector could learn a lot from these broad private sector theories, and because it's much easier to see when it doesn't work in private companies, because ultimately they'll lose money or the share price will go down.
That's true. There's another way into the topic, which is, I think we have this coordination game that you've enunciated, describing how the public sector can help people coordinate, and so that individuals can have more opportunities and build things together. But if the government was to suddenly disappear, individuals would also look at ways that they could coordinate themselves as well. So prior to the existence of the poor laws in the UK, your unemployment insurance, in a sense, was all coming from the church, and the church was sort of a quasi-public entity that was established through time in order to achieve that. You have social clubs, rugby clubs where people can go along and support each other, and different forms of what I think we can term social capital. How important do you think it is for private individuals to be able to interact with these private-ish entities that allow them to coordinate and form community? And is that complementary with public services, or sometimes does it generate tension?
I think the issues we have is, well, perhaps it goes back to this question from the Bible: who is my neighbor? I think in the old days we had these local social groups, and they were essentially physically mediated. Today, who is my neighbor is a much broader question, because we've got all these online communities. And so what's happening is the idea of who are these groups of people that might band together to achieve a common purpose is, well, it's global in some cases. And I think at least that question reflects, an old world where the only ways we communicated, we saw people face to face, and maybe that's the way we learned to trust them. And so we'd all put some money into a kitty, or it was the local church or things like that. We've got a very different dynamic now, which is people all over the world interacting. I think it is a big challenge then, because actually the cultural assumptions they're making become harder. Yes, they come together over a common purpose, but then they're operating in very different environments. And so it's not clear to me that you can have quite as effective arrangements there. But I also don't see a way back to, this idea that, yes, let's switch off the internet for a day and all go out and smell the flowers and meet our neighbors. I guess I see that as something that may have been a source of strength in the past, but I find it hard to imagine those sorts of communities working going forward. And in the absence of that, when individuals now find it harder to make those connections, and you've got kind of a world out there that you can connect with, but in a way that is perhaps less powerful, I think you do need government to step into the gap that in the past that might have filled. I can't see a way of going back.
Yeah, and the those growing international connections are probably part of the reason why we're importing a lot of US narratives here as well. When we're looking at this, would you say that there's a sort of main takeaway about institutions that you'd like to finish up on? If someone was just to listen to one thing, like on a TikTok or a Twitter video or something, what would be your main point that you would like people to take away about institutions in Australia?
Institutions are like the air you breathe. You need to care if it's polluted or not. I think you want clean air because you don't want to be breathing that polluted air, and it's the same with institutions. You really do need to care about the strength of institutions. It's like breathing smog. You really don't want to be doing that. It'll get you in the long run. So don't take it for granted. I think we do have a problem with air pollution, if you will. And I think if you focus on that rather than the more narrow interests that politicians or whatever are always encouraging us to do, I think we might well be able to get back to a much better outcome. And it's focus on the foundations and then trust that what will be built on top of it will be good. But if you don't have the foundations right, it's not going to work.
Exactly. And I completely agree. I don't believe that Australians are fundamentally just about their personal self-interest. I think that they do care about these institutions and they care about a fair go. And I think the issue is more that it's easy for political arguments to focus on self-interest rather than to give a vision of how we do things as a community and together. So the more we can talk about that and the more we can describe it, the better it'll be. So thank you for this chat today, John. It was great fun.
Yep.
Was there anything else you wanted to plug or to mention just before we finish up?
Well, perhaps for people who might have thought, is this a talk about economics or not? I will say that economics is fundamentally about incentives. And really, this is just what happens when you start thinking about what are the incentives, what are the rules of the game that we are operating in, and as an individual, what influences my decisions. And once you start thinking about that, you kind of inevitably go down this route of actually caring about institutions. And so you don't need to be an economist, but if you do reflect on what is the incentive this is giving me, and is this something that I think will lead to good outcomes overall, as opposed to, yes, how much money am I getting, thinking about the structure and the framework. And that's why, that economic mindset is a very useful way of thinking about this. This isn't stuff that has kind of just been made up because it's a good idea. I think it's very much thinking carefully about, what is the framework, what are the rules, and what are the incentives that leads to.
Exactly. Or, to completely abuse your statement, I'm just going to say economics is everything and just make sure I upset anyone who listens.
There you go. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for listening. See you later.